In the field of psychology, Machiavellianism is a personality trait centered on manipulativeness, callousness, and indifference to morality, with high levels of self-interest. The term is derived from a 16th century Italian philosopher named Niccolò di Bernardo Machiavelli and his most famous work, The Prince. In the underworld of the American Mafia, there have been some mafiosos who embody this personality trait. To them, the ends always justify the means. They are Machiavellian Mobsters, and these are their stories. Number 17. Carlos, the Little Man, Marcello. Carlos Joseph Marcello was born Calogero Minicore on February 6, 1910, in Tunis, French Tunisia. His father, Giuseppe Minicore, and his mother, Lucia Minicore, like many other poor Sicilians, left Sicily in 1908 to find better opportunities in French Tunisia. At the end of September in 1909, it had been decided that Giuseppe would leave North Africa and travel to America. Their family had friends and relatives living in New Orleans, and word had traveled back that there were many more opportunities in Louisiana than in Tunisia. 5 months later, she would give birth to Calogero. Later in the year, Lucia returned to Sicily, and in October, she and the baby sailed away from Palermo to join Giuseppe and begin their new life in America. Sometime later, in October of 1910, the Italian steamship Liguria, carrying 625 passengers, docked in New Orleans. Calogero's father adopted a different family name to avoid confusion with his superior on the sugar plantation where he had started work. His boss, who was also named Minicore, chose the name Marcello. From then on, Giuseppe Minicore had become Joseph Marcello. The family followed suit, and Carlos and his 8 siblings, Peter, Rose, Mary, Pascal, Vincent, Joseph Jr., Anthony, and Salvador, all now had the surname Marcello. Carlos grew into a tough, squat, muscular image of his father. He was always the leader of the pack among his siblings, who learned to accept the fact that he was the boss and gave him their untiring loyalty and support. He left school at the age of 14, and by then he was entrusted by his father to deliver the farm produce over the ferry to the market in New Orleans. There he would fight for the best prices among produce dealers and wholesalers. The vegetable and fruit markets had long been under control of the Mafia, and it was inevitable that young Carlos would become involved with people connected to the well-established secret society. As he got older, Marcello began to spend more of his time with the people he dealt with at the fruit markets along Decatur Street. He found it easy to adapt to their ways and began his schooling in the world of criminality by studying seasoned hoods and street punks who worked the fringes of the Mafia. At the age of 18, Carlos and 2 young thugs he recruited robbed a grocery store owned by a Chinese trader. The money was to finance the purchase of firearms which would be used to commit other robberies. However, a desk clerk from the grocery store spotted the 2 young accomplices on a street in Algiers. Arrested by the police, they gave up Carlos and he was arrested. On May 28, 1930, he was sentenced to serve 9 to 12 years in the dreaded state prison in Angola. His father worked tirelessly to get him released, and after serving only 4 years of his sentence, Carlos Marcello was out of prison. The fix had gone in, first through a member of the state legislature, and then a mysterious power broker called Peter Hand, who wielded a lot of influence with Governor O.K. Allen. He eventually issued the pardon. The manipulation of politicians and senior officials in the local government of Louisiana would be a trademark of Carlos Marcello in the years that lay ahead. Marcello would build up and consolidate his power base in what was one of the most corrupt political arenas in America. Out of prison at the age of 24, Carlos found his brothers and sisters were all growing up and shaping their own lives. His father Joseph had expanded his interests outside of the farm and into shrimping. As soon as he had built up enough capital, Carlos used some of it to make a down payment of $500 on a rundown bar in Gretna, the Jefferson Parish county seat. Frequented almost entirely by black workers, Carlos renamed the bar the Brown Bomber in honor of heavyweight champion Joe Louis. Carlos brought in his brother Peter, now a handsome, well-built young man of 22, to manage it. Gretna was in those days a seedy community on the west bank of the Mississippi, operating under a corrupt police force and an equally corrupt city council, all of whom were in the pocket of the Mafia. To visitors, it offered gambling halls and whorehouses, drug dens, and bars that stayed open all hours and catered to anyone of any age. The Brown Bomber soon established a reputation as a good place to score drugs, drink, and gamble around the clock. If a customer got unruly, Carlos would personally toss them out himself. Although he never grew any taller than 5 feet 4 inches, he was built like an oak stump and developed a reputation as a fearsome brawler. He paid off the local mafioso who controlled the block on which his bar was located, and through him kept the police at bay. Around this time, he would also meet Frank Todaro. Todaro knew Marcello to be a stand-up guy who was immersed in the rules and beliefs of Cosa Nostra, or the honored society as it was sometimes known. Todaro was the underboss in the Louisiana crime family, which at the time was run by boss Corrado Giacona. While still in his mid-20s, Marcello would be sponsored into the family by Todaro, and shortly thereafter would officially become a made man. Soon there were family ties as well. Carlos's sister Mary, now aged 19, became the best friend of Todaro's daughter, Jacqueline, who was a bridesmaid at her wedding. As a result, Carlos, the best man at the wedding, met Jacqueline and fell head over heels in love with her. After a brief courtship, they married on September 6, 1936. Early in 1937, Carlos and brother Vincent, who was now approaching 18, set up a pinball and jukebox distribution outfit they called the Jefferson Music Company. Soon, the two of them were strong-arming their way into bars and restaurants all over Algiers. Running the bar, the liquor store, and the gaming machine company was not enough to satisfy Marcello. He saw the huge profits being made in the area of drug trafficking and decided to get into the business. Starting out small in 1935, the operation grew fast, and by the end of 1937, he and 4 partners had built up what the Federal Narcotics Bureau described as one of the major marijuana rings in the New Orleans area. In March 1938, an undercover drug agent posing as a dealer bought 23 pounds of marijuana from Carlos and then arrested him on the spot. On Saturday, October 29, 1938, Carlos pled guilty before Judge Ruffs E. Foster and was sentenced to a year and 1 day in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He was also fined $76,830. He settled this for a token payment of $400 on the plea that he was a pauper. Again, strings were pulled, and he was released after 9 months, again being pardoned by the generous governor, O.K. Allen. As his reputation grew, Marcello began to meet powerhouses in both organized crime and politics. In the mid to late 1930s, Marcello would partner with Luciano family boss Frank Costello and the governor of Louisiana, Huey Kingfish Long, to bring Costello slot machines to the city of New Orleans. In New York City, Mayor Fio LaGuardia had issued a crackdown on all slot machine operators in the city. Costello needed a place to house his gambling machines, and Marcello and Huey Long would provide that place. It was agreed that Jefferson Music Company would install and service 250 machines for a fee of 2/3 of the gross, with the rest disappearing into one of Frank Costello's newly formed enterprises, the Louisiana Mint Company. Marcello was a tireless operator and soon had all the slots in place, pumping out money on a daily basis. They were located in bars, whorehouses, restaurants, and gambling dens, across Algiers and Gretna. It was during this period that Carlos became close friends with the Gretna chief of police, Beauregard Miller, one of the many important people he would come to nurture over the years to come. Marcello would give Sheriff Miller huge amounts of cash from time to time, with amounts as high as $50,000. This ensured his support and cooperation in the free running of many of his criminal enterprises in Jefferson Parish. Carlos also began to look after himself and his family. By 1941, there were 2 young daughters added to the family, and they all moved from the cramped apartment above the liquor store into a 2-story house in Gretna. Although he was only in his 30s, Carlos had become a seasoned veteran and highly respected earner for the mob. He was a man to be reckoned with, even though people still called him Little Man. On July 25, 1944, boss Corrado Giacona died, and the position of boss was immediately filled by Marcello's mentor, underboss Frank Todaro. However, Todaro's reign was a short one. Frank Todaro died on November 29, 1944. Todaro would be succeeded by a powerful capo named Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo. There are conflicting sources, with some alleging that Silver Dollar Sam secretly held the title of boss since the death of Charles Matranga. Either way, after Todaro's death, there was no question who the boss was. Meanwhile, in 1944, Frank Costello, along with Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky and Castell and Freddie Rickefour, opened a nightclub and gambling casino and called it the Beverly Club. It was situated in the old Suburban Gardens nightclub in Jefferson Parish. Carlos Marcello was cut in and given a 12.5% stake in the club. The Beverly Club opened in December of 1945 and was an immediate success. People flocked into its palatial dining rooms, bars, and gaming rooms, and it soon established a nightclub where it hosted major entertainers of the day, such as Jimmy Durante and Joe E. Lewis. Carlos was appointed manager of the club, and along with his brothers Anthony and Peter, was also becoming more involved in managing the gambling operations of Frank Costello. Jefferson Parish police were recruited to act as doormen and bouncers, ensuring the safety of the club. To keep the wheels of his organization running smoothly, Marcello continued to build up his chain of influential contacts. Along with Costello and Huey Long, he also had Sheriff Frank King Clancy, head of the Jefferson Parish Police, in his pocket. 30 years down the road, the FBI would tape Marcello boasting of his generosity. Marcello would say, "I used to give them all cash money. I'd go out in the morning with my pants full. I took care of everybody." In the late 40s, Marcello continued to be active in many business ventures. He and his brother Vincent were building up the Jefferson Music Company to include services for racetrack gamblers. He joined forces with underboss Joe Pareto to take over the largest racing wire in Louisiana. He would then use those profits to purchase West Bank real estate. He and his wife Jacqueline now had 4 children, and they moved into a new home in Marrero, an upscale suburb 10 miles southwest of New Orleans. Meanwhile, Louisiana Mafia boss Silver Dollar Sam Carolla began having legal issues. Because Carolla never became a citizen, he was always open to deportation hearings. These dragged on for years, but eventually he was convicted and flown out of the country on May 30th, 1947, to relocate in Sicily, the place of his birth. As Carolla was counting down his last days in America, Marcello was promoting himself as the natural successor. He had emerged among the capos who ran the street crews as the most probable candidate. He was a proven earner with money pouring in from narcotics, gambling, slot machines, and his racing wire service. He also opened a casino named the New Southport Club on the East Bank, which would soon become enormously popular and hugely profitable. No one else in the crime family could match Marcello's personal magnetism, energy, or ambition. Most of all, in an organization that fed on fear and greed, no one in the ranks could inspire as much terror as could Marcello. Politicians and gangsters alike treated Carlos with respect paid to a man that should not be crossed. Washington lobbyist Irving Davidson, a friend and business associate of Marcello, said, "Look, when you deal with him, remember that loyalty and trustworthiness are everything to him. If you violate that, you can expect the worst to happen to you." As he said this, he slowly drew a finger across his throat. Late in the evening of May 5, 1947, a group of men gathered together in a room at the back of the Black Diamond, a nightclub in a seedy part of New Orleans that catered almost exclusively for black people. The mob used this for a rendezvous in the belief that it would reduce the chance of surveillance. On this particular night, they were wrong, and agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were checking out the expensively dressed white men who disembarked from limousines at the rear of the club and disappeared inside. Among those in attendance were Tom Rizzuto, Nick Grafazzi, Frank Lombardino, Joe Capro, and Anthony Carolla, the son of Silver Dollar Sam Carolla. Also along were Joe Pareto, Nofio Pecora, and Carlos Marcello, along with brothers Vincent, Joseph, Peter, and Anthony. Jake and Nick Marcello, Carlos's nephews, were also in the party. Although supporters of Anthony Carolla put his name forward, they were outvoted by Carlos's men, and by the time the meeting was over, Carlos Marcello was the newly appointed head of the Louisiana Mafia. Anthony never forgot his disappointment from what he obviously believed was his rightful ascension, and 19 years later would bring his grievance up before a National Mafia Commission meeting at a restaurant in New York, but that would come later. The crime family Marcello inherited was a successful mixture of gangsters, policemen on the take, and corrupt politicians. Marcello understood the family's success depended as much on the people who wanted their illegal services as the bureaucrats who allowed them to operate openly to achieve their objectives. The mob only gave people what they wanted. The fact that their wants were illegal was of no concern to Marcello. By the late 1940s, Marcello had established his headquarters in a bar and restaurant that came to be known as Willswood Tavern, where he would hold court with his capos and his administration. Marcello appeared before the U.S. Senate Kefauver Committee on Organized Crime on January 25, 1951. He pleaded the Fifth Amendment 152 times. The committee called Marcello one of the worst criminals in the country. They would cite him for contempt, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Eventually, an appeals court overturned the verdict. The committee did make known for the first time the extent of Carlos Marcello's position and power in organized crime. After his encounter with the Kefauver Committee, Marcello realized the government might try to remove him from the scene through deportation proceedings and send him back to Sicily, or even worse, Tunisia. Consequently, in order to confuse the authorities, he arranged a fictitious Guatemalan birth certificate in 1953. In 1953, Marcello purchased a group of buildings in Rossier City on Airline Highway, the main thoroughfare connecting New Orleans to Monsant International Airport. Consisting of a motel in one block, a restaurant and lounge in another, and his office complex in the third, it was called Town and Country Motel. This would be his base for the rest of his criminal career. Two of Carlos's most trusted lieutenants, Nofio Pecora and Joe Pareto, were put in charge of running the complex, along with one of his younger brothers, Anthony. The place became a meeting place for top-level gamblers, Marcello's men, crooked politicians, and equally crooked cops. Within 13 years, Marcello would be possibly the wealthiest mafioso in the United States, and certainly one of the most influential. His criminal organization would be generating $2 billion each year, making it the biggest industry by far in Louisiana. As the leader of the first mafia family in the United States, he enjoyed unique privileges such as he could open his books and make men into his organization without the approval of the commission. His control and dominance of the Louisiana Mafia was incontestable. The late Vincent Teresa, a top mafia thief and enforcer working out of the New England mob, said of Marcello's crime family, "It was very tight. They're all in deathly fear of Carlos Marcello because he's got the law, all the politicians in the state, right in his hip pocket. You just can't go against him. Then on March 24th, 1959, Marcello was called to appear before the United States Senate's McClellan Committee investigating organized crime. Serving as chief counsel to the committee was Robert F. Kennedy. His brother, Senator John F. Kennedy, was a member of the committee. In response to the committee's questioning, Marcello invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer any questions relating to his background, activities, and associates. From then on, Marcello became an avowed enemy of the Kennedys. In 1961, Aaron Cohn, head of the New Orleans Crime Commission, reported on the makeup of Marcello's blood family and their relationships within their criminal mafia family. Eldest brother Peter, who was 40 years of age in 1953, managed strip clubs in the French Quarter. Pascal, who was 36, operated an illegal gambling house in Gretna. Vincent, who was 31, ran the Jefferson Music Company. 28-year-old Joe Jr. was Carlos's right hand and took over the position of underboss from Joe Pareto, who stepped down. Pareto, despite stepping back, still ran the wire service and booking network with help from Joe Jr. Tony, age 26, helped run the Town and Country Motel, and Sammy, the youngest brother, 24, aided the management of the Jefferson Music Company and also acted as Marcello's bagman. All the brothers and the two sisters of the family were married. They and their children would meet every Sunday for lunch at the home of the family patriarch. The Louisiana Mafia was similar to the Sicilian Mafia clans and differed from many of the American Mafia families because they were truly a family with blood and marriage connections throughout its hierarchy. On April 4th, 1961, Carlos Marcello paid a visit to the office of the Immigration Services in New Orleans. He was required to do so 3 times a month as a registered alien. Before he knew what was happening, he was in handcuffs, being conveyed by motorcade to Moisant International Airport. There, he was bundled onto an aircraft that took him to Guatemala City, 1,200 miles away. On May 5th, Jack Wasserman, a lawyer who worked for Marcello, filed suit for his immediate return. Marcello was deported by the Kennedys on the basis of a forged birth certificate. Marcello was deeply offended by his treatment. Years later, he told a congressional committee, "They just snatched me. They actually kidnapped me." He never forgave Kennedy, and to his close friends, swore vengeance against the man for the way he had been treated. The next 8 weeks would be some of the worst in Marcello's life. After his arrival in Guatemala, he was able to contact his wife, and soon she and her daughter Florence and son Joseph Jr. joined Carlos. They all moved into the Biltmore Hotel, along with Carlos's lawyer, Mike Maroon, and 2 of Carlos's brothers, Sammy and Vincent. About a month after his arrival, the government informed Carlos that it had arranged for him to be returned to America. When the party arrived at the airport to embark on their trip back to the United States, Carlos was suddenly told that his visa had been denied. Instead, he and his lawyer were taken by Secret Service agents to the adjoining state of El Salvador and left at an army camp. Eventually, they were taken into the capital, San Salvador, and handed over to the commander of a large military barracks. In due course, the commander informed the 2 men that they were to be taken to Honduras to a small provincial airport where they would fly out of the country. However, after about 6 hours of travel on a small decrepit bus, the 2 were simply dropped off in the middle of the jungle and left stranded there. After a journey that lasted almost 3 days, walking up and down mountains and in and out of jungles, the 2 middle-aged, overweight men, dressed in clothes more suitable for urban maneuvers than wilderness adventures, eventually staggered into a small airport and hired an airplane that flew them to the Honduran capital. Battered, bruised, dirty, and utterly exhausted, they checked into a hotel and slept for 48 hours. Mike Maroon then flew back to New Orleans to reassure Marcello's family that Carlos was okay, and eventually, Carlos landed back in America on May 28th. Just how he returned is a mystery. Marcello claimed he obtained a visa and bought a ticket on a commercial flight to Miami, where he had no trouble passing through immigration and customs. However, a government investigation indicated that he had in fact been flown into the country aboard a Dominican Republic aircraft. Now back in New Orleans, Marcello and his lawyer Jack Wasserman successfully fought further efforts by the government to deport him. In November of 1963, Marcello was tried for conspiracy to defraud the United States government by obtaining a false Guatemalan birth certificate and conspiracy to obstruct the United States government in the exercise of its rights to deport Carlos Marcello. Marcello was acquitted later that month on both charges. However, in October of 1964, Marcello was charged with conspiring to obstruct justice by fixing a juror named Rudolf Hitler and seeking the murder of a government witness named Karl Knoll. Marcello's attorney admitted Hitler had been bribed, but said that there was no evidence to connect the bribe with Marcello. Knoll refused to testify against Marcello in the case. Without Knoll's testimony, the jury acquitted Marcello of both charges. On November 26, 1963, United States President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was shot and killed. Though the Warren Commission, which was the entity created to investigate the assassination, stated that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone killer, many felt Marcello and others in the Mafia may have been involved. No charges were ever filed against Marcello related to the assassination. By 1966, Carlos Marcello had been the chief executive of his criminal dynasty for almost 20 years. Through bribery, corruption, intimidation, and an inherent ability to control situations, he was probably the wealthiest and most influential mafia leader in the United States. Marcello ruled his fiefdom as a despot, with an independence and insularity that was unique across the 24 or so other criminal groups that made up the national syndicate of American Italian mob families. Joseph Valachi, a former soldier in the Genovese family of New York, was the first made member of any mafia family to turn informant and publicly testify as to the inner workings of the mafia in America. When asked at the McClellan hearing what he knew about Marcello, Valachi replied, "Louisiana? I don't know a thing except they don't want visitors. Once I was going to see the Mardi Gras, and I checked it out with Vito, which I was supposed to do if I took a trip. He said don't go. No explanation, just don't go. They didn't want anybody there, and I was told if I ever had to go to Louisiana, Genovese would have to call ahead and get permission. Genovese himself had to get permission. It was an absolute rule." Although he was in federal prison serving time on drug trafficking charges, Vito Genovese was at this time arguably the most powerful mob boss in America. Yet even he would show deference to the little man from New Orleans. Carlos Marcello had manipulated the unholy trinity of politics, crime, and business like no gangster ever had. Even an organization run as smoothly as the Louisiana Mafia had its bumps in the road. On September 22, 1966, a group of men met for lunch in an Italian restaurant called La Stella, which was located at 102-111 Queens Boulevard in the borough of Queens, New York. Carlos sat at a table with his brother Joe, who was his underboss, along with Anthony Corolla and Frank Gagliano, two of his senior family members. Corolla had apparently been seeking a greater share of the New Orleans mob action, citing seniority within the family and his family birthright. His father had been Silver Dollar Sam Corolla, who had run the family until deportation in 1947. Anthony was also apparently seeking approval for consideration to take over the New Orleans Mafia when Marcello eventually retired. These, and no doubt other matters, had been resolved at another venue, and the group had then moved on to La Stella for a late lunch. This meeting at La Stella was discovered by the press and made headline news in the New York papers, and was soon circulated across the country via the news services. Also at this meeting were Carlo Gambino, Anello Della Croce, and Joe N. Gallo, representing the Gambino family, Joe Colombo, representing the Colombo family, Santo Trafficante Jr., representing the Tampa family, and Tommy Ryan Eboli, Dom Elongi, and Mike Miranda, representing the Genovese family. After the meeting, Marcello and his men would head back to New Orleans. On October 1st, Carlos and his brother Joe flew from New York to New Orleans International Airport. There was a large crowd of reporters, photographers, and spectators waiting there to meet him. As they moved through the throng in the terminal building, there was suddenly a scuffle, and Carlos threw a punch at someone. He later claimed that he did not know who it was, just someone blocking his way, and he impatiently let fly with a straight left. However, the recipient of the punch was someone he knew well. It was FBI agent Patrick Collins, who kept tabs on Carlos for the New Orleans office. Eventually, the case came to court, and on May 20th, 1968, Carlos went on trial in Laredo, Texas. This venue, over 600 miles west of New Orleans, was chosen to isolate him from any potential prejudice that might have been present in New Orleans at the time. Yet again, he avoided jail time due to a hung jury. In June 1971, the FBI reorganized its New Orleans office and appointed a young, tenacious agent named Harold Hughes as head of a strike force to target Carlos Marcello. By 1972, with the death of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI was finally able to exert real pressure on the Louisiana Mafia. On January 11, 1978, Marcello appeared as a witness before the House Select Committee. He had not been called as a suspect, and his sworn testimony was given under a grant of immunity. In the final report, the committee stated, in its investigation of Marcello, the committee identified the presence of critical evidentiary elements that were lacking with other organized crime figures. Credible associations relating to both Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby to figures having a relationship, albeit tenuous, with Marcello's crime family. Things would continue to heat up for Marcello when on June 17, 1980, he, along with 3 other men, were indicted by a federal grand jury on 12 counts of racketeering. On August 4, 1981, Carlos Marcello was found guilty on the charge of violating the RICO statute, which carried a penalty of up to 12 years imprisonment. The very next day, on August 5, 1981, he was indicted by a Los Angeles federal grand jury for conspiring to bribe a United States district judge. On November 30, 1981, he went on trial in Los Angeles, and 11 days later, the jury found him guilty on all 3 counts. On January 25, 1982, Marcello was back in a federal courthouse in New Orleans. Judge Maurice Seacon handed down a sentence of 7 years in prison and a fine of $25,000. Out on bail, Marcello had to wait until April of 1982 to find out what his fate would be in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, Marcello was sentenced to 10 years in prison. At the hearing, Judge Edward DeWitt said to Carlos, "You led a life of crime. By any evaluation, it's fair to say you're a very bad man." On April 15, 1983, after all his appeals had failed, Marcello was remanded to the United States Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, to begin his sentence. 2 months later, he learned his appeals against the Los Angeles conviction had also been denied. He now faced the prospect of 17 years in prison. Marcello would be incarcerated at Springfield for almost a year, and then in April of 1984, he was transferred to another federal institution at Texarkana near the Texas-Arkansas state line. This would be his home for the next 2 years. Then on February 19, 1986, he was moved once again, this time to a near-minimum security facility at Seagoville, Texas. This was a prison for basically white-collar criminals, lawyers, doctors, and accountants who had committed crimes of embezzlement and tax fraud, rather than the hardcore acts of criminal violence. Marcello was only here for a short time, and then was shifted again on June 2, 1986, to the Level 1 Federal Correctional Facility at Fort Worth. After a year of living at the minimum security facility in Fort Worth, he was suddenly and without notice shifted back to the near maximum security conditions of the Texarkana Penitentiary on May 21, 1987. He would be there until March of '89, when he transferred for the final time to a federal prison hospital in Rochester, Minnesota. This was due to the mobster's deteriorating health. Marcello had suffered a series of strokes that had left him severely disabled, and by the end of March, he was showing obvious signs of Alzheimer's disease. At times, he had become so disoriented that he thought he was living in a hotel and could not recognize family members who visited him. One judge denied this reversal, but his decision was overruled. In October, after serving 6 years and 6 months of his sentence, he was released and the old Don was finally returned back to his family's care. "I'm retired," he told reporters. "I'm happy. Everyone's been nice to me." He returned to his family and his white marble 2-story mansion overlooking a golf course. Here he lived out the last years of his life, cared for by a group of nurses and watched over by his wife and family. Apparently, he lost the power of speech and regressed to infancy. He was never seen in public again and died on March 3, 1993. Carlos Marcello was a true puppeteer, pulling the strings of politicians, criminals, and law enforcement to do the dance of his choosing. Never has there been a mafia boss who held more power in his area of influence than Carlos Marcello. Despite being uneducated, he was able to build an empire using Machiavellian principles. His shrewdness, ambition, and audacity made him one of the most successful mafia bosses in the history of American Cosa Nostra.